So Windows has security settings out of the box. You deploy it connected to your network. If you haven't done any hardening, there are a lot of important security settings that Microsoft doesn't turn on by default. But if you don't turn them on, then your system is potentially vulnerable, especially on the internal network, to unscrupulous individuals who might want to break into the computer. Things like SMB signing is kind of an obscure security setting that most people wouldn't think to turn on. But if you don't, my pen test team is going to take over your network.
Hello, business leaders. Today we have a very special guest, Terry Bradley from Mile High Cyber, and we are going to talk about cybersecurity and penetration testing and why it's important for your business. So Terry, it's a pleasure having you. I really appreciate you taking some time to come in and talk with us and hopefully provide some real value to a lot of the business leaders out there.
Thanks, Matt. Cybersecurity and penetration testing are things that I'm very passionate about. I've been doing this for about 30 years. Got my start in the U.S. military, the Air Force, and then transitioned to working at the National Security Agency, doing security testing on military devices that were supposed to be secure, but in many cases they weren't really ready for prime time. And so that's where I kind of cut my teeth in the penetration testing world. And maybe some of your guests are wondering what a penetration test is.
Yeah.
We sometimes throw around the term penetration test or pen test, and it has nothing to do with ballpoint pens, but it's really an ethical hacking engagement where organizations engage my company and my team of testers to act like hackers and try to break in to an application or a network, and then based upon what they found and how they were able to get in, provide some guidance on how to fix that so that they can help our customers not get hacked and have a painful and expensive security incident.
I think that's really valuable because we never know what we don't know. And when you're doing defensive implementations of cybersecurity and it's not really been tested yet, it's really hard to know if you're getting the impact that you want to. And there might be vulnerabilities that are penetratable that could be a real risk to the business. And if you don't know, you can't really address them. So that makes a lot of sense. What size companies do you think should be doing penetration testing?
Well, I think once you have some security measures in place, if you haven't even designed a security program, you're probably not ready for a penetration test. But if you have security measures in place, the modern EDR, intrusion detection, you've configured your systems to be hardened from an attack, then there's really no small size or large threshold that you have to reach to be ready for a penetration test. Essentially, the penetration test is checking to see if your security really works like you think it does. And so small organizations can benefit from that. We've got customers that are as small as 2 employees. They engage us to make sure their security is working. And then we, obviously do tests for bigger organizations, all the way up to Fortune 100 companies.
All right, very cool. So Terry, what kind of things do you test in a penetration test?
Right. So a lot of organizations have the perception that if they're small, they're at very little risk. And in a penetration test, we try to identify what we call the attack surfaces. These are the things, the places, the points of entry into the network where employees and authorized users get access to the data. And so we're looking for those attack surfaces, things like open network ports that are facing the internet. A lot of times businesses have applications or software that's accessible from the internet and it's not properly secured. Should be behind a VPN, but it's just out there on the internet for anyone to attempt to try to connect to or log into. Other attack surfaces are applications that are not up to date. So those ports that are open or maybe on the internal network, there's applications, operating systems that haven't had security updates or patches applied. That's another thing that we typically look at. And then finally, users, the employees themselves. Pretty much everyone has email these days in a business. And so folks from around the world can email your employees and try to trick them into either providing information or taking actions that are going to result in a loss for the business. So user security awareness is a often overlooked attack surface that we will test during a penetration test.
I think that makes sense because people tend to be the biggest risk that a company will have. It's not too hard to keep your systems up to date and patched and make sure they don't go end of life. But if you don't have training for your team, all of those security protocols can be bypassed with a simple click. And so that training for your team is definitely going to be important.
Yeah, users are empowered with a lot of access to information, especially in the modern age of cloud computing, Microsoft 365, Google Workspace. They've got access to a lot of data, a lot of files, and they have the keys to the kingdom, their password, their user account. If they haven't been trained on how to protect that, you can hardly blame them for getting tricked.
Sure. That makes sense. So you mentioned companies both large and small can all do a penetration test. There's not like a size limit that makes it where it's not cost effective to do a penetration test. How often would you recommend penetration testing being done?
It really depends on how often your network is changing. As a rule of thumb, most regulations require annual penetration testing. Regulations that require you to have certain security measures in place. Maybe in the Department of Defense world, CMMC is an example of one of these regulations, or in the credit card world, payment card industry, PCI standards, or possibly HIPAA for healthcare. Most of those regulations require annual penetration testing, but some organizations will have more frequent penetration tests because they can't afford to have a serious security breach. So maybe they have a quarterly test, or maybe a semi-annual, or maybe after a big migration. You've changed your architecture, you've put in different security mechanisms, and you want to find out, are they working like we think they're working? Do we have blind spots or limited visibility on certain segments of the network? So it really depends on your risk tolerance and what your regulatory requirements are.
On that same note, and this is something that affects all of us businesses, is we all have a cyber liability insurance policy, or at least we should. And most of those policies are at least asking the question now, are you doing a penetration at least annually, just like you mentioned? So if you're not doing that, that could affect premiums or even your insurability, where you may not be insurable. So I think even if somebody's not under some kind of government regulation to do penetration testing, it makes a lot of sense for their cyber liability insurance policy. And as we already talked about, it makes a lot of sense of just knowing, is your IT company doing everything they need to be doing, to keep you secure on the web?
Right. And then the other thing that I've seen driving interest in penetration testing is consumers and customers are getting more cyber savvy. And so they're starting to ask companies they do business with, who does your security testing? Have you had a penetration test? When was your last one? And so I would say, almost a third of the inquiries we get about penetration testing are because customers are asking businesses, have you had a penetration test? Who's evaluating your security, and how do you know it's working?
How do you feel about like the IT company doing a penetration test versus a third party doing a penetration test?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And because of the demand for penetration testing, a lot of IT providers want to make that an add-on service. The problem with that, as I see it, is that it's kind of like trying to proofread your own report. You can probably catch some of the mistakes you made by reading it out loud and reading it very carefully. But I know from personal experience, I'm not good at proofreading my own reports or my own emails. And so I have someone else to do that. And so I think the independent nature of penetration testing is we're going to get someone who has an outside perspective, maybe someone who is really specialized in cybersecurity, who understands how attackers operate. We want them to test our security, not ourselves. Now, I think IT companies, IT providers could and should do vulnerability scanning. I think that's part of an effective security program to make sure patches are being deployed. But I think the penetration test it's sort of like an exercise. The military does these. They have war games, and they say, okay, we're going to actually do the plan and see what gaps we find in it. And so the pen test is really, I think, almost has to be independent.
Since you do a lot of these independent penetration tests, what has been your experience when working with the IT companies of your clients? Do most of them embrace the information you're able to provide? Are some of them worried or concerned about looking bad? Is there some kind of dynamics there that makes your job more difficult?
Yeah, I think there's always a great deal of concern, whether it's an internal or an external IT provider. there's always a concern that, they're being evaluated, that this is a pass-fail proposition. I will often hear people say, did we pass the test? And we try to tell people up front, this isn't, the SAT. This isn't, your final exam. This is a checkup. This is a physical. And just like you want doctors to identify problems that you have as early as possible, a penetration test should be, trying to find as many security flaws that are serious and exploitable as possible. And we try to do that in a collaborative way. We don't. There's an expression in the pen test world. We don't dance on the graves of the IT people. We identify the security issues in a calm and non-dramatic way. Communicate those quickly so they can be fixed. And then, we move on. We're adults, we're professionals. We try not to hurt anyone's feelings in the process. But at the end of the day, we want the vulnerabilities identified and fixed so our customers don't get hacked. And there's oftentimes a reluctance of IT teams or IT providers to want to have that evaluation come to them. But I think once they've been through the process and they recognize that, we're not here to make them look bad or not here to take away their jobs, then they generally embrace it. And we try to work collaboratively with those folks.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of danger for an IT company if they are more concerned about their reputation than the security of their clients. Like if their ego gets in the way, they're so intent on trying to look good to their clients that they can't have any holes. And we all have holes. Like we don't know what we don't know. So there's always something that would probably need to be addressed that we just aren't looking at. And it would be so much easier to address that before an incident actually happens. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, as a business owner, I'm very concerned about my brand and my reputation, so I understand that. But I also am a potential target, and so I want my systems to be secured because that will be an even bigger blow to my reputation and my brand if I get hacked.
So what are some of the typical flaws that you find in an organization after doing a pen test?
Yeah, I think there's sort of this mystique about penetration testers that, we have these magic techniques that are going to break through firewalls and decrypt files magically. Most of the findings in a penetration test are really pretty straightforward. The most common thing we see, here we are in 2024, and we still see this almost every month, is we'll see default credentials. Some classic examples are username of admin, password of admin. And we see that all the time. It's our good friend. And when we see it, we say, okay, we know exactly how to fix this. This isn't hard, but it just takes someone going and looking in all the places to make sure it's not there. Another common security flaw we see are missing security updates. And I'm not talking about this month's Microsoft update. We find systems that are 2, 3, 5 years out of date with no security updates. And so there's a lot of publicly available exploits and tools that will break into those systems that hackers will absolutely use if they find them. Hopefully those systems are on the internal network behind a firewall, but sometimes they're exposed to the internet. And we may not be the first people to break into that system. If it's exposed on the internet, probably people are scanning it every day and have probably already broken in. So missing security updates and software patches, probably another one of the biggest findings in a penetration test and allows us to get in. And then the other thing we see quite a bit is weak security configurations. So Windows has security settings out of the box. You deploy it connected to your network. If you haven't done any hardening, there are a lot of important security settings that Microsoft doesn't turn on by default. But if you don't turn them on, then your system is potentially vulnerable, especially on the internal network, to unscrupulous individuals who might want to break into the computer. Things like SMB signing is kind of an obscure security setting that most people wouldn't think to turn on. But if you don't, my pen test team is going to take over your network.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's where lateral movement comes in. So you've got your perimeter that you're trying to protect, but the first thing that happens is usually somebody gets some low level of access in the systems, and their first move in the attack chain is lateral movement. Try to get to other credentials and other systems, something of more value, before they actually architect and execute on whatever cyber plan that they have. So I think that makes a lot of sense to not only harden your perimeters, but also harden, your environment internally as well. And there's also insider threat. So if there's a chance that, somebody is inside doing something malicious, either accidentally or intentionally, you can mitigate some of the risks there as well. So does your pen test, is it just an external pen test that's looking at everything that is public facing, or is it actually an internal pen test as well to look for vulnerabilities that are exploitable inside the network?
It can vary. We do probably maybe 50% or less external only pen tests. Maybe a customer has a compliance requirement to have an external pen test, and that's all they want done right now. They're not ready to bite off on letting us into the internal network. But I'd say probably about half of the penetration tests we do involve not only the external part of a pen test, but also testing the internal network. That's kind of covering the case where what if a user gets phished, or what if somehow a bad person gets on your internal network? It's the case where the thieves get into your house. You should have not all your life savings sitting on the kitchen counter, and so we do quite a bit of internal penetration testing as well.
I like that analogy. So we talked about vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. What's the difference? I think a lot of people aren't very clear of what's the difference between their IT company doing a vulnerability scan, and is that enough, versus doing a penetration test.
Yeah, I try not to argue semantics with customers. If they say they want a penetration test, but it becomes clear to me they really only want a vulnerability assessment, we'll still call it a penetration test. But in my mind, the line of delineation is a vulnerability scan or a vulnerability assessment just identifies vulnerabilities and tells you what to do to fix them. The penetration testing part, the penetration is the exploiting those vulnerabilities. So when we do a penetration test, we're not only looking for security flaws that can be exploited, but we actually do go exploit those flaws. And the reason we do that is not only because it's interesting or fun, but it actually allows us to determine what the business impact is of those security flaws. A lot of times we will find some old system that time has forgotten on a network, and we'll talk to the customer and say, we think we can break into this system. Do we have permission to try that? There's always a chance that when you're hacking into a system like that, you might cause a negative impact. So we'll coordinate that with the customer, maybe do it off hours if it's a critical system. But in having that discussion, sometimes we'll hear, no, we don't want you to hack into that system. It's not important. A great example was we had a customer that had a mapping server, a GIS server. And they said, no, there's no point in hacking into that thing. There's no sensitive data in there. It's just maps. And we said, well, if you'll allow us to do this, I think we'll be able to demonstrate why this is important. And so we did break into that server using an old exploit from several years back. And once we were in, we were able to extract all the passwords that were stored in the memory. So sometime within the recent past, an administrator had logged in to that server to do some maintenance, and his password was still resident in the memory. We were able to pull that password out, clear text, and that allowed us to have domain administrator privileges on all of the systems in the entire network. Yeah. And so the system that didn't seem important was really kind of the weakest link and had the keys to the kingdom. And the penetration test, will help uncover those kinds of issues. I
always call it the NVC, the most vulnerable computer. Like your computer's only or your network's only as secure as your most vulnerable computer or system. So that's a really good point. Since we're talking about penetration tests and we contrasted the vulnerability scan with what a pen test is, are there different kinds of pen tests out there? And what would make sense, I guess, for different business leaders when they're looking at getting one of those done?
Sure. I would say I can answer that in two different ways. One is, penetration tests. There's no standard out there really to say what constitutes a penetration test. Mm-hmm. There are some methodologies. There are some, guidelines. Different entities have said you have to do these things to meet our requirements, but there's no real gold standard in terms of what a penetration test includes. Our typical approach is to ask a customer, what do you want in your pen test? Do you want external testing? Yes. Do you want internal testing? It's optional. Do you want us to evaluate and try to break into your wireless networks? Mm-hmm. Do you want social engineering? and that can come in a couple different flavors. Email phishing would be one kind of social engineering, phone call pretexting, or sometimes it's called vishing, voice phishing. Maybe even physical social engineering, trying to talk our way into a building or into a data center. So there's the different components of what's included in your pen test. That is one way to answer that question. The other way to answer it is not all pen tests are equal. Most penetration tests are fairly tightly scoped, meaning the customer has said, we need a pen test, and this is what we want you to test. And we'll get that in writing. Which domains do you want us to test? Your top level email domain and other domains you might own. What are your external IP addresses? We don't want to hack into the wrong company. There's nothing more embarrassing than saying we found this critical security flaw, and a customer says, that's not my computer. So, okay, never mind. So we try to get that scope figured out ahead of time, and it's usually fairly tightly scoped what we're testing and how we're supposed to test it. There is a kind of school of thought that you need to replicate the attacker more. And that school of thought is called red teaming. And in a red team pen test, the scope is broadened. It's opened up more. You still agree ahead of time what you're going to do. Maybe you have a rules of engagement document that you sign and have your lawyer review. But essentially in a red team engagement, it would typically involve social engineering, maybe even bypassing locks or climbing in through a window. It might involve exotic attacks like mailing a package in that is actually battery powered and is going to try to get onto your wireless network. I've even heard of long-term red team engagements where a person tries to get hired by the company and then they perform malicious actions. All this, of course, is coordinated up front.
That's been going on for some time. Yeah. I've seen medical companies where they had a low-level position at the front desk, hires, and their job was to exfiltrate data that could be sold on the dark web.
Yeah.
But they didn't have any protocols and there's no controls to prevent uploads because it's part of the business. But when they're uploading large amounts of data on the weekend, you should have an alert go off. That's going on. This is unusual activity. So are those services, as you were describing, all services you provide in your pen test, depending on the scope?
We do. We don't get a lot of calls for red team engagements.
Okay.
Most people are not, they don't have the appetite for that level of testing. But larger organizations typically who have very mature security programs, they're looking for, okay, what's left? What else can we do? We know the real bad guys are coming after us. So, we want you to replicate that threat.
Yeah, they know it's happening to them already, but if they can do it ahead of time and mitigate risk, that really helps. Well, do you have anything else you'd like to share? Any things that you think business leaders should be considering and thinking when they're looking at both cybersecurity and if pen test makes sense?
Yeah, I would just say the final thing you need to consider when you're assessing your risk tolerance and trying to decide, what kind of an investment you're going to make in cybersecurity is understanding who the threat actors are. There's a lot of people out there doing this. If you think about it, the food pyramid or the food chain, at the very top, you have the apex predators, which are nation state actors. These are the foreign intelligence services of the world. And I know a lot of small businesses probably think, well, they're not interested in me. I'm not storing national security secrets. But some of those state actors will go after small businesses because of their proximity to their actual target. Maybe you're a supplier for government or military. And so you are now, part of their attack chain. If they want to stage a supply chain attack, you may be the weakest link to get to the actual target. And so you yourself might be targeted by nation state actors. That's kind of the top threat that's out there in terms of the most sophistication and funding. But then there's also a lot of organized crime. I think there's a perception that the hackers are disaffected teens sitting in their parents' basements. In reality, most of hacking nowadays is industrialized. It's specialized. You have access brokers who sell access. You have folks who specialize in breaking in just for the purpose of selling that access. And then you've got, further down the food chain, you've got entrepreneurs, we'll call them, who are essentially just benefiting from the other hackers. They'll buy access and then deploy ransomware. They call that ransomware as a service. It's kind of like multi-level marketing for crime.
Yeah, the cybercrime has become franchised.
Yeah.
Like you can go into business, hang up your hat on the blue side and jump on the red side and contract, basically they'll take a percentage of your winnings, your ransomware winnings, and they'll give you all the systems and the trainings and the process and everything you need to perform those types of services. So it's gotten almost commoditized.
Yeah, it's never been so easy to make money in a third world nation as it is now because of cybercrime and people who will basically supply you with all the tools and the training that you need to do it. And if you're in a part of the world that doesn't cooperate with law enforcement, there's very little risk to you ever getting caught or brought to justice. And so there's large numbers of groups, not just large numbers of hackers, but Mandiant, cyber incident response company, they're tracking over 4,000 groups that they can uniquely identify who are out there perpetrating these crimes. And so it's prolific. We only hear a fraction of the security incidents that happen on the news because a lot of times people want to keep it quiet. They don't want their brand damaged, and so they do whatever they can to not publish the fact they've had a breach. The SEC is forcing publicly traded companies to publish that information, but a lot of privately held companies will try to keep it quiet. But it's absolutely prolific. I guarantee you that all of your listeners have either themselves had a security incident in the last few years, or they know someone who has.
Yeah, it's gotten to that point. Well, I felt like, especially around 2020, we moved from a focus on prevention to an assumed breach mentality where we just know that it's just a matter of time before companies are going to be compromised, all of them. My company, your company, like there's going to be some level of attack that's going to have some level of success. The question is are you going to know that it happened? And are you going to be able to respond in time before something bad happens? And there's a lot of process and tools that could happen, that can be in place to prevent that.
Yeah, I think in the past, people were in the mentality that we could dodge this bullet, that we could avoid it from happening. But if you look at bank robberies, when banks were new, they would periodically get robbed. Over time, we're not surprised that criminals want to rob banks. And so banks don't think that they're not going to ever get robbed or no one's ever going to try to rob them. They put in preventative measures to make it very difficult. And then they also have a lot of detection mechanisms in place and response procedures. And so businesses need to do the same thing on the cyber front. It's not only about preventing hackers from getting into your network, but you have to have really good detection because chances are at some point they're going to get into your network. And then the response is what do you do? Who are you going to call when you've had a serious security breach? Having an incident response plan, having those actions defined ahead of time is really smart. And as you mentioned before, cyber insurance companies are starting to ask their insured, do you have an incident response plan? Have you ever practiced it?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Terry. This has been very informative. I think it's probably opened the eyes for a lot of business leaders of why a pen test should be on their radar to do this year. Is there a good way for them to reach out to you to get more information?
Sure. I think the easiest way is just to go to our website, milehighcyber.com, and we've got a big contact us button. So if you fill out the form and send that in to us, we'll get back to you right away.
Very good. I appreciate it. Thank you.